Great. So, welcome everyone to join this webinar. So we're going to start. Um, so for this webinar, as you all see the advertising materials that is jointly organized by three organizations, Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, also known as From Asia, Asia Democracy Network, ADN, and Lady Liberty Hong Kong. For this seminar, the topic itself that we want to focus is on like how we would assess the controversial so-called safeguarding national security ordinance in Hong Kong, which is actually more commonly known as Article 23. On 19th of March, the Hong Kong government passed this legislation, although like it has been like in debate for many years, and also drew up a lot of controversy. And how we want to look at from a perspective of how it would affect the civil society in general, and also for media, journalists, and also whether it only affects people in Hong Kong or from Hong Kong or actually beyond the scope. So we are very happy to have three distinguished speakers to join us today. Each of them, we will have 20 minutes for them to talk about their perspective. And then we will have a session of Q&A and the question and answer session for 30 minutes. So altogether, it will be 1.5 hours. So we would like to give more chance for each of us to have more interactive discussion. So do feel free to ask your questions, both answering in your voice call, or you actually can also type your questions when we come to the Q&A session. So to begin, that we would have our first speaker, Ms. Alessandra Villokoska. She's the advocacy officer with Reporters Without Borders, with the Asia Pacific Bureau. So for the past 7 years, Alessandra has been based in Taiwan, where she also worked as the Taiwan correspondent for the Polish Press Agency. She's a graduate of the University of Warsaw and National Cheng Chi University in Chinese Studies and International Relations. Her main expertise and interest centers on East Asia, with a focus on China's political and social issues, as well as human rights. So thank you very much, Alessandra. This is your floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Just to let you know, I don't know if it's on purpose, but the video is not working for me, but on my side it's fine. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And as Patrick has mentioned, I'm based in Taiwan, and for the past 4 years, actually, I've been working for Reporters Without Borders. And Reporters Without Borders, for those of you who don't know, we are the international non-governmental organization that acts for the freedom, pluralism, and independence of journalists and defends those who embody those ideas around the world. Our organization works not only in Asia. We actually are based in Paris, and we have at least 13 bureaus and sections around the world. And we have a quite huge team in Taipei right now that has been working on support of journalists from China and Hong Kong, and also other countries in Asia Pacific region. And we developed a lot of programs in support of journalists, such as capacity building, emergency assistance. But for myself, as advocate officer, I have a chance to observe for the past 4 years on my own eyes the downfall of press freedom in Hong Kong. As the advocacy officer, my role is to observe, to document what is happening, document the violations on right to information, press freedom in the region to publish statements, to work on our advocacy and campaigns to support journalists, including in Hong Kong. And this is something I've been doing actively for the past 4 years. And for me, maybe because Article 23, and this is something that Simon will go in depth. I'll mention this in a second. But what for me is more important maybe is to see what happened in the last 4 years since the national security law was implemented by Beijing at the time, and how it actually impacted the right to information and the press freedom in the territory. Because the impact is quite immense, and even for us as the NGO that advocates for those rights, I think we haven't seen in our, for me for sure, but even for my colleagues who have been working for Reporters Without Borders for a longer time, we haven't seen such a downfall in any other country around the world. And it can be shown by the numbers, because in our RSF Press Freedom Index, which is published annually, actually the new series, the new publication of the index will be held tomorrow, so I cannot give you the number from this year. Maybe mention that will be very similar, is that the Hong Kong has fallen from 180 to 140 and plummeted from 80th place in the index just in 2 decades. So the scale of the downfall of press freedom is really uncomparable to any other place in the around the world. And we saw it, and we have evidence for it. I saw it also with my own eyes, which I will go to in a second, because I was traveling to Hong Kong in the past 12 months, two times, with the last time that I was actually barred from coming to Hong Kong. But we see it with the journalists and press freedom defenders who are detained in Hong Kong, including the publisher and Apple Daily founder, Jimmy Lai, who faces right now the rest of life behind bars on trumped-up charges of espionage. And we saw during the course of the trial that the evidence are, we can say this, fabricated, that they use any means to put him and to lay him, to make him a victim. And they target also not only him, but other Apple Daily editors, and it's not only them, because for RSF, actually, we count right now 10 journalists and press freedom defenders in detention in Hong Kong, not to mention other 28 cases of journalists and press freedom defenders who have been prosecuted for the scope of the 3 years, actually 4 years since the NSO was implemented. And what is interesting, not only with national security law charges, because there's many other means for harassment of a journalist in the past 4 years. We sit with the Hong Kong Journalists Association chairperson, Ronson Chan, who has been charged with obstructing of the police officer. We see it with Stenius and with the sedition charges. But to go back to the story, actually, we saw in the past years that government used any means necessary, anything in the power, and I could witness this as the NGO worker, to forcibly shut down at least 2 media outlets, which is Stenius and Apple Daily, 2 mainstream media outlets that have been read and basically read by vast number of residents in Hong Kong. At the last day of Apple Daily, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right now it was 1 million Hong Kongers who queued to get the copies of the Apple Daily newspaper. We saw at least 5 media outlets that ceased to exist because of the atmosphere of fear that has spread throughout the city, including most recently the Bureau of Radio Free Asia, that decided to close, citing the security concerns and citing the safety of its staff. And exactly because of what happened with Article 23 and the previous national security laws. We saw also numbers of media outlets that have been receiving in the past few months, because just since February, the letters from the government that were basically correcting, saying that what they publish is misleading, what they're saying is not factual, and again, sharing with them and sending the red flags saying that you cannot go this direction because you can be next, even for the foreign media outlet, which is very, very concerning. Not to mention the public broadcaster, Radio Television Hong Kong, which is right now and was one of the most renewed independent media outlets and has been working in the past on many independent investigations with renewed investigative journalists, and has been placed under the government appointed management right now. And the role right now is just to share what what Beijing also authorities and Hong Kong authorities want them to share, and basically focus on the propaganda of the territory and the city. And this, I could speak about these cases really for hours. And what we see actually with what happens right now with the Article 23 is that the things that we saw in the past, the things that we saw in the Beijing post-national security law, they're right now transposed to the national security provisions imposed by Beijing. And I think the government did it because it hoped to restore the illusion that it has control of what is happening in Hong Kong. But at the same time, introduce so many new provisions that are actually in face of journalists themselves. I know Simon will speak about it more, but for me, as the NGO worker who's focusing on the right to information journalists, I see it very concerning that Article 23 introduced things such as espionage, the theft of state secrets, external interference, because this is something that has been used very broadly in the past years against journalists in mainland China. We saw it with cases of journalists such as Australian journalist Chen Lei, who was just recently released after being detained for 3 years in prison on suspicion of illegally supplying the state secrets overseas. We see it with the case of Swedish publisher Gui Minhai, has been sentenced to 10 years in prison in 2020, again on the vague charge of espionage. We saw it with Yang Hanjun, has been sentenced recently for the suspended death sentence, also because of the espionage. And when I'm speaking about these cases, what is also very interesting is that all of them have double passports. The same is, for example, with the Taiwanese publisher Fucha, who is right now being held, and Radio Television Taiwan host, who has been held right now for more than a year, also under very vague charges of the national security crimes, without showing any evidence, without showing what exactly he did when he just went there to revoke his Chinese passport to get his Taiwan citizenship. And we can speak about number of cases like this in China. And when we see that Hong Kong government is going into the length of introducing this type of regulations in Hong Kong law, it's starting to be very concerning. And of course, I cannot say right now how it influenced yet the scene and basically of Hong Kong journalists in the territory. It's been just a month, but indeed is very concerning, threatening, and also when we see what happened in the past 4 years, we can just imagine that it will be used even more in the future, and it basically expanded the toolbox of Hong Kong authorities under this illusion that is their toolbox and it's in their hands. The last thing I will mention maybe about Article 23, because this is something that I think as the NGO that advocates for right to information, we are concerned the most right now, is the sedition, because the sedition right now faces 10 years in prison with Article 23. And sedition has been used in the past very vividly against any independent voices in the territory. Myself, I can only speak about journalists, but to give you one very important example of CNews, who was raided by 300 police officers, and many of its staff has been arrested first. Right now, 2 of the editor-in-chiefs are facing 2 years in prison because still under the colonial era law for sedition, and 17 articles, which is really something new and something unseen before in Hong Kong. 17 articles are used against them as evidence in court. And if Hong Kong went at this point to the length to to frame the articles that they publish. Again, some of them were open, but again, it's factual reporting of journalists against the two editors, and they can still go back to jail. Their sentence was delayed again, a verdict to the end of August, but we are really concerned that they will go back to jail for another year if they use it against them. And now they changed the law that it will be 10 years maximum. It really gives a very warning signal to any other journalist in the territory, and makes them in a way to self-censor, what we also saw in the past 4 years. Just to maybe go back to my story also, because it's very interesting. It happened just 10 days after the Article 23 was enacted by the authorities. Myself, I've been traveling to Hong Kong in the past 12 months, two times, actually. Third time, I'll mention in a second, was unsuccessful attempt of entering Hong Kong. And in the scope of this 12 months, I really could see and witness with my own eyes how the atmosphere has changed in Hong Kong since the NSL was enacted. And just to mention that many people were asking us why only 12 months ago, why we haven't tried to go to Hong Kong in 2020 when this happened. And the simple reason for that is because we're based in Taiwan, and because of very, very severe COVID-19 restrictions, it was very difficult for us to travel for the 2 years. So then after that, when the COVID was eased and we finally could decide to go there to see on our own eyes what is happening, we traveled first to Hong Kong in, it was June 2023. And at that point, I could witness everything that I said. So I could witness what happened. I could witness what type of tool it left on Hong Kong journalists, in which way they were speaking about the experience, how they try to protect themselves through, in a way, self-censorship, but also to witness that there are still journalists who are trying to do amazing work, and despite the threat, they still trying to check these red lines and see how far they can go until something might happen to them. There's many media outlets that opened after the Stenius and Apple Daily closure, but at the same time also many journalists who left the territory, because 900 people at least lost the jobs, and many of them decided to relocate and go on exile abroad. But there are still journalists who trying to work, and we met with them at the time. And we see how many problems they're facing. We saw how difficult the situation has started to be for them. But we, again, with this emphasis that they were still trying to do the work, which was very encouraging for us. And we thought it's also a sign for us that maybe not everything is lost, and that we maybe can continue the work and to support them in the territory, offer them our capacity building, assistance, think how we can explore and how we can work on our field, especially because as the NGO that advocates for press freedom, we do exactly what the government says that is still working in Hong Kong, because John Lee and Executive Chief John Lee and also Beijing authorities, even a few days ago, they said that the press freedom is still thriving and it's in basic law and nothing has changed. So yeah, we thought maybe we can continue the work and support them as much as we can, and support them with any means that are necessary in this very difficult already environment. And this was the first trip. The second trip that we took part was in December. I was also traveling with my colleague. She's the development and projects manager. And it was the first time actually that on my own skin I could see the red flags warnings. We traveled to Hong Kong at the time to attend the first day of a Jimmy Lai trial. We wanted to be the only NGO, we were the only NGO, at least to my knowledge, present in the court at the time, which again shows that it's very difficult to NGOs to continue the work, and it's very difficult for them to even send someone for the basic thing as the observing of the public hearing. And we entered the court, we managed to do so, but what happened there is actually that we've been followed at least twice, noticeably followed, which didn't happen in the first trip. We could see this as the warning signal to us that we need to watch out for what we say, what we do, We've been covered widely by the media when we attended the Jimmy Lai hearing. We wanted to be seen also because this is our role to show that the world is watching, that NGOs are looking at the hands of Beijing apparatus and what they do. What is interesting, we needed to queue, and I think many of other journalists and people who are attending the hearings right now experience this also, that we need to queue since 5 a.m. because just after us, there was plenty of Beijing patriots queuing up who are trying to take away the seats of those people who actually are there to support Jimmy Lai and to see what is happening in the court. And this was shocking for us, that they go to the length to monitor, to surveil, to follow the NGO that actually is just there to do the work. And also the fact that again, we just do what they say, that is open for everyone. That's something that shouldn't have any implications to our work, but of course it has. And also we saw it delicately with some other journalists who are starting to be more and more cautious about meeting with us. So not everyone wanted to meet with us at that point. And this is also something new because it didn't happen in December. So we see that it was just a scope of few months that it impacted what we do. And then the last trip, I will speak about it shortly, is that happened to me just a few days ago on 10th April, when I was trying to enter Hong Kong. And actually, I was stopped at the border by the immigration officers. When I scan my passport, they look at the screen of the computer, and without giving me any reasons whatsoever, without giving me any explanation, asking any questions, they actually start to fill my refusal note. They send me with other two immigration officers to other rooms and started to question me, interrogate me, asking about my work, asking about the reasons of my travel. The whole situation and the incidents took around 6 hours, and it was very obvious that my situation is treated totally different than other people with immigration reasons, because I observed and witnessed with my own eyes that that for other cases it takes around 15 to 20 minutes to deal with them. For me, when they took me, they right away after half an hour told me specifically that you'll not go away very quickly, and they give me the hint that I will be taken for longer and questioned for longer time than other people. What's also interesting, I was searched many times. My bag was searched to the scope that they took my pens from it. They checked what is written on them. They were very careful how if I'm not having anything on me that could be I don't know, claimed as an evidence. They checked really every piece of my clothing, of my notebooks and so on. What is interesting, we knew that it might happen. We've been prepared, so we didn't take our personal phones with us. We used only burner phones, and also we didn't have our computers on us. And the reason for that is because we didn't want to put our contacts under threat if something like this might happen. And with the following that happened in December, we thought that, yes, we observed by the authorities and we need to take this into consideration. So yeah, it took 6 hours for them to deal with my case. Then after, in the end of this ordeal, they decided that they sent me back to detain me and deport me back to Taiwan without giving any reasons, which is also, I would say that's ridiculous in a way, because I asked many times about the reasons of me being detained, many times about why it's happening to me, why they don't want me to go out to Hong Kong when I was traveling so many times, and there's no reason whatsoever to keep me out from the territory. And what they're afraid of if they don't want to get the NGO worker to observe what is happening right now in the territory, when there's so much claim that everything's perfect as before and even better than what happened in the past. But they didn't give me any reasons. The only reason they told me is the immigration reasons, which of course is not reasons. And when you go back in other cases, similar cases of journalists, we see that they always use this type of wording to acknowledge and to say why they do what is in a way really, I don't want to say illegal, but of course they have legal means to do those things, but it's really rational, and in my opinion, it's also giving them a lot of black PR that they creating for themselves, and showing exactly what is the purpose and what are the reasons and why they're doing this to not only journalists but also right now the NGO workers. So that was the story about me. We don't know if we can go back to Hong Kong in the future. Maybe we'll try again when we have the assurances from the authorities that it's possible. We'll try our best to get these assurances, but taking consideration what happened in the past years, taking consideration Article 23 and the fact that it happened to me just after the Article 23 was implemented. And again, I don't know if it was the reason, but it could be one of the reasons why they decided to do so right now. I think it will be very, very difficult for not only us, but also for any other NGOs to continue the work, to observe on their own eyes, to take part in the trials, and to be there for people as we used to be in the future, which is very concerning and of course sad. But let's see maybe what will happen in the next month proceeding and how they will try to implement Article 23 and how they use it against the remaining journalists in the territory. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, for your very comprehensive description on like the situation, especially on like the cases like Jimmy Lai, and also in particular concerning like on your own experience. I mean, like it also shows how daunting the situation is with the this new law, and how actually civil society and also journalists and also, I mean, like people in general, how they would need to deal with it. That would be actually something we would need to look forward to the implementation. But how it would be implemented, it would also be very much related to law, the text, and also how do we interpret it. So our next speaker, for Simon Henderson, he's an international human rights lawyer, a foreign policy analyst, an academic, and also he's a visiting lecturer at the Education University of Hong Kong, and the University of Tokyo. He teaches human rights and advocacy skills. So he also sits on the Human Rights Committee of the Law Society of New South Wales and Law Asia. So we are very lucky to have him to share his expertise, the legal expertise with us. So here's your floor. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to Forum Asia, the Asia Democracy Network, and Lady Liberty Hong Kong for inviting me to speak here today. It's a great privilege to be here alongside Alexandra Bielikowski and Shivani Matani, and thank you, Patrick, for chairing. Since the NSL came into force in June 2020, national security has become all-encompassing in Hong Kong. It's affected the legal, societal, and political systems in a radical way. And this was only further exacerbated by the entry into force of the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, or the SNSO, commonly known as Article 23 law. And this is principally what I'm here to speak with you about today. I will, in my own way today, be telling a Hong Kong story well. However, is not one that the Hong Kong government will rush to place in the opinion pages of the Washington Post, the Sydney Morning Herald, or the Financial Times, for that matter. Instead, what I'll be doing today is I'll outline the impacts and effects of national security laws. Firstly, I'll summarise the international human rights law implications of the SNSO. Secondly, I'll run through the arguments that the Hong Kong government uses on the SNSO. I'll break them down, I'll outline where they're misguided, and I'll clarify their errors. Thirdly, I'll provide guidance on ways to better engage with international and regional organisations to support responses to the SNSO. So firstly, on the international human rights law implications. The SNSO adds to, clarifies and updates existing national security laws, including the NSL, which already criminalises succession, subversion, terrorism and collusion with foreign forces, as well as adding to the colonial era sedition law, the public order ordinance, COVID-19 measures, and the societies ordinance, all of which have a substantial impact on human rights. Principally, the SNSO amends existing legislation and creates new criminal offences, including treason, secession, sedition, subversion, insurrection or incitement to mutiny and disaffection, and the offence of revealing state secrets, with sanctions that can be up to life imprisonment. Organisations that engage in endangering national security are subject to separate sanctions. There is this new offence related to sabotaging and endangering national security, which carries a penalty of up to 20 years imprisonment, and another new offence around external interference in activities endangering national security, which seeks to restrict acts of collaboration with external forces, which carries a sentence of up to 14 years. The SNSO, both in a legal and political sense, helps to align Hong Kong's national security laws more firmly with China and Chinese Communist Party ideology. The intent was clearly outlined through the so-called consultation process, which preceded the law's introduction, and the 110-page paper, which outlined an intent to criminalise benign activities. Language such as colour revolution, soft resistance, and black-clad violence were littered throughout. It is my assessment that several provisions of the SNSO breach Hong Kong's international human rights law obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCA. This is also the view of United Nations Human Rights Special Rapporteurs in their communications with the Hong Kong government. These human rights breaches include, but not exclusive to, freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and association, the freedom from arbitrary detention, the right to a fair trial, freedom of movement, the right of privacy, and the right to take part in the conduct of participation in public affairs. Let me give you an example. The new offence of external interference in activities endangering national security comes under Part 6. An offence is committed by an individual who collaborates with an external force to do an act with intent to bring about an interference effect and uses improper means when doing the act. The problem is the offence sets a very low threshold due to a combination of overbroad and a vague definition of what is national security, that there's no requirement for there to be any physical harm caused or intended, and the requirement is merely to influence authorities, which can lead to the incrimination of potentially innocent associations with external forces. External interference also covers ordinary advocacy and lobbying activities which are protected under international human rights law, which the Hong Kong government is obliged to abide by. This includes the freedom of expression under Article 19 of the ICCPR and the right to take part in public affairs under Article 25 of the ICCPR. Some of the benign conduct that could cover includes activities I used to undertake when I worked at Justice Centre Hong Kong. While I was there, I set up and I led the Hong Kong Universal Periodic Review Coalition between 2017 and 2019. For 2 years, together with other NGOs, over 45 NGOs, we regularly met with foreign governments and UN human rights mechanisms as part of Hong Kong's human rights review process under the third Universal Periodic Review of China as it related to Hong Kong. In my view, sadly, that conduct would be a breach of the SNSO, as well as much broader engagement with UN bodies. So now I want to turn to what are the Hong Kong government's arguments on the SNSO. Part of what I want to ensure that everyone here comes away with from the panel is knowledge and insights to engage in informed discourse and advocacy. And this can't be done without analysing the Hong Kong government's arguments. So I'll step through 5 of the key arguments, although there are many more. Firstly, the human rights argument. You often hear the Hong Kong government say, well, the rights and freedoms of the ICCPR and ICESCA are not absolute, and they may be subject to restrictions if it's necessary in the interests of national security. I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase before. The problem is the Hong Kong government never really goes beyond this particular step with their statements. To begin with, there are absolute rights under the ICCPR. That's not correct. Article 19.1, the right to freedom of opinion, is absolute. However, states can only restrict freedom of expression under Article 19.2 in very limited circumstances. It requires 3 conditions. Firstly, it must be provided by law. Secondly, it must protect national security or public order. And thirdly, it must be necessary and proportionate. And the SNSO consistently fails the third part of this test when it comes to necessity and proportionality. For example, offences for vague activities of sedition have been greatly increased from 2 years up to 7 years and potentially up to 10 years if there's a connection to an external force. This is despite the lack of connection to any physical violence or harm. Another example that fails this test is the meaning of what is an external force under Article 6. One of these categories is international organisations. This could cover an extremely wide variety of organisations and was, in my view, drafted to give that intended effect. Secondly, the Hong Kong government argues that there are appropriate protections in the SNSO at 2B because it says that rights under the ICCPR and ICESCR are to be protected. The references to the ICCPR and ICESCR in the SNSO, in my view, are of limited value. The SNSO, as I've already outlined, in its current form is incompatible with Hong Kong's international human rights law obligations, and there is no intent to reform or amend the SNSO from the Hong Kong government to ensure that it does comply. Furthermore, the Hong Kong government has made it clear that the national security considerations will take precedent over any human rights considerations. It's important to recognise that provisions of internal laws, such as national security laws, cannot be invoked as as justification for failure to perform a treaty. This includes human rights treaties, and this is outlined in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties in Article 27. Thirdly is the Hong Kong government's argument around rule of law. You often hear the government say, well, the rule of law is a core value, or that all cases are strictly handled in accordance to law. And this reference is also contained in the SNSO at 2C. In recent years, the Hong Kong government has the rule of law has become increasingly eroded away. The law has become less certain and clear. The law has been applied in a discriminatory manner on arbitrary grounds, and the Hong Kong government is failing to comply with their international legal obligations. The Hong Kong government is increasingly promoting a concept of the rule of law which is politicised and heavily focused on compliance with the law. It is not a form of rule of law that is accepted by the United Nations or the international legal community. Rather, it is increasingly becoming aligned with a Marxist-Leninist rule of law legal tradition, and it should be rejected. The Hong Kong government is spending huge resources to transform this perception of what is rule of law. Much of this was outlined in an October 2022 paper from the Department of Justice. An example of one of these measures is that the government has been organising drama performances for school children, one which is titled Xie Zhi, The Legend of Justice. The Department of Justice has organised these drama performances for schools all over in Hong Kong, and they're aimed at, to use their words, ensure that children learn a proper concept of the rule of law, enhance awareness to comply with the law, and cultivate a law-abiding spirit. To be clear, just because a law exists does not mean that it complies with the rule of law. Fourthly, the Hong Kong government argues that laws outlined in the SNSO are comparable or even milder than national security laws in other countries. This is often used with reference to the UK, US, Australia, Canada, and other common law countries. There are a few problems with this argument. Firstly, the most straightforward one, of course, is Hong Kong is not a democracy. What this means is that, unlike in the UK, US, Canada, or Australia, the law will not be amended in Hong Kong. I do not see any possibility of that happening. Indeed, even suggesting so will be roundly condemned. Paul Harris, the former chair of the Hong Kong Bar Association, was hounded out of Hong Kong for suggesting amendments to the NSL back in 2022. Secondly, in those countries, there is robust debate about what national security laws should look like. This doesn't happen in the same way in Hong Kong, and it can't. Law societies, bar associations, civil society organisations are actively involved in writing submissions, reports, giving interviews, and outlining their concerns with compliance of national security laws with human rights considerations. This does not substantively happen in Hong Kong. Civil society organisations are either actively promoting the national security laws, such as the Law Society of Hong Kong, they've been forced to close, such as Civil Human Rights Front, or are one of countless organisations which actively engage in self-censorship to continue operating. Much of this domain is sadly left to organisations overseas. Thirdly, in many jurisdictions cited by the Hong Kong government, such as the UK and Australia, there are independent national security legislation monitors that regularly review laws to ensure they are necessary, proportionate, and comply with international human rights law. Fifthly, is the Hong Kong government's argument that the extraterritorial effect of the SNSO and other national security laws in Hong Kong fully align with the principle of international law. In practice, the extraterritorial application of national security laws by the Hong Kong government to date has not complied with international law. The NSL has been used to extend the capacity of the Hong Kong government to undertake transnational repression against human rights defenders, such as in the case of bounties placed on human rights activists and lawyers in July last year. The SNSO targets absconders, including through suspending their qualifications or their passports, or even suspending their ability to carry on a business. These measures are unjustifiable infringements on international human rights law to which the Hong Kong government is a party to, namely the ICCPR and ISESCA, including rights such as the right to work, freedom of movement, and the right to privacy. So I now want to outline some of the ways that there can be more effective engagement with international and regional organisations in ways that will defend human rights and freedoms in the face of the SNSO. So I'm going to outline 6 tactics. In doing so, I'm not going to be comprehensive. There are many more activities, but I'll focus here on the legal responses. Firstly, I think there needs to be a process of delegitimising Hong Kong's legal system. Let me explain what I mean by that. Hong Kong's legal system, with its common law traditions, has always been spoken alongside that of the UK, Canada, Australia, among many other jurisdictions. It's a point of pride for the Hong Kong government, and it's consistently referenced in connection to the defence of the SNSO. However, the legal system and extra legal measures are increasingly used as a tool to target civil society organisations and human rights defenders, and more widely upend the legal, societal, and political environment. It is importing legal concepts drawn directly from China, and Hong Kong's legal system has diverged from its historically liberal rule of law legal culture. I believe that in public discourse and in the international legal community, we should no longer speak of Hong Kong's legal system with the same degree of credibility anymore. I think that requires a cultural shift. It needs delegitimisation through greater education and awareness raising through seminars and events such as this, but much more comprehensively. Secondly, I think there needs to be more engaging with international legal associations to ensure critical voices are represented and their rights and freedoms are promoted. This is related to my previous point. In supporting delegitimisation, there should be closer engagement with Law Asia, the International Bar Association, the Council of Bars and Law Societies of Europe, national legal bodies and others. The Hong Kong government, Law Society of Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Bar Association take great pride in their engagement with foreign bar associations. They regularly fund breakfast events, conferences, sign MOUs, and they widely support the national security laws, and they're actively supporting the crackdown. Just have a look at the LinkedIn profile of the Law Society of Hong Kong to receive an update on their activities. I had the privilege of attending one of these national security law events, which was a breakfast briefing on the Law Asia conference in Sydney in November 2022. I was the only person there in the room providing an alternative voice. These legal professional body forums are influential, and there is much greater capacity to do more with them. That includes supporting lawyers who are in Hong Kong doing great human rights work, but are not able to fully engage with Hong Kong legal bodies for fear of reprisal. For example, one of the measures I'd recommend is legal professional bodies from all of those countries cited by the Hong Kong government in reference to the SNSO to prepare a joint advocacy paper on their human rights and rule of law concerns. Thirdly, there should be greater space to protect and support civil society organisations to engage with the United Nations and its human rights mechanisms. As I highlighted before, one of the major problems with the SNSO is this broad reach under Part 6 in terms of engaging with external interference. We've seen the effect of the NSL to date already, and the SNSO just provides an even greater deterrent for civil society organisations when they want to engage with the UN and human rights organisations. So this work has happened for years, but it should continue, it should be strengthened. Working through safe spaces with NGOs and universities to ensure that first-hand information is presented, and counter the growing deployment of government-organised NGOs, or GONGOs, by the Chinese and particularly now Hong Kong government. Fourthly, there should be a concerted effort to ensure there's regular and consistent trial monitoring. Many organisations have done amazing work in this space, as RSF has talked about and Alexandra mentioned before. There's Hong Kong Watch, the Centre for Asian Law at Georgetown, among others. There should be greater support from donors, university, pro bono support from law firms and law societies to ensure that there's record keeping and analysis to inform developments. Trial monitoring, is already extensively adopted by legal professional bodies. We've seen this in Malaysia, we've seen it in Turkey. The Law Council of Australia, the International Bar Association have done that. They need to be doing this more in Hong Kong. Fifthly, there should be more coordinated legal engagement with states, especially those that are referenced as peers in connection to the SNSO. So I refer to countries such as the UK, Australia, Canada, and in US. Joint coordinated action has increasingly become a hallmark of states in reference to China and Hong Kong. That should continue. But foreign governments should be clearer and expand on the particular human rights concerns and also what they mean the definition of rule of law to include, especially outlining the importance of legal certainty, access to justice, and proportionality. Because right now we have a situation where the Hong Kong government and foreign governments are using the same words. They both say rule of law, but they both mean very different things now. Governments should also be pressured to urge a visit by the UN Special Rapporteurs, including the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers, even acknowledging that it's unlikely to be accepted. And they should continue to explore the use of targeted human rights sanctions in an effective manner. Sixthly, and finally, I believe that foreign judges sitting as non-permanent members of the High Court should resign. In my view, their continued presence serves to provide legitimacy for the repression and weaponization of the legal system against human rights defenders. Furthermore, they are constrained in any event in observing and safeguarding human rights. For example, foreign judges are barred from attending hearings of the High Court Appeal Committee, which decides whether leave is granted. And the expansion around the decision of who can be appointed to review national security cases by the chief executive has only further diminished roles. I do not believe they're needed in any event, and they've long since passed their utility. So I began today's presentation by saying I would tell Hong Kong's story well. That story is one of repression, fear, and intimidation created by the ever-broadening reach of Hong Kong's national security law apparatus. While I've outlined the significant challenges facing civil society organizations and human rights defenders in the legal system, I want to leave you with a message of hope. In the same way that human rights activism has of course continued in China and outside, the same will happen with Hong Kong. And there are still so many amazing organizations doing excellent work in Hong Kong that need to be supported, even with the challenges posed by the NSL, SNSO, and other national security laws. There are a range of actions which I've outlined today, among many others that I think can help support Hong Kong residents, as well as activists overseas in defending their rights and freedoms amidst the implementation of the SNSO. Thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I mean, it's a really good questions on how we think of the legitimacy actually of this law, and then also with all the analysis that you made on how actually the law would be compatible or not compatible at all with the international laws, and then also how the government define the rule of law, and also how they define democracy, and then how define external forces, whether we are also actually external forces by their standard. So it's actually very very much concerning. So we will now have our next speaker, Shibani Mahtani. Thank you very much for joining us. She's an international investigative correspondent for the Washington Post. She was previously the Post's Hong Kong and Southeast Asia bureau chief and correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore, Yangon, and Chicago. Hong Kong coverage was honored with prizes, including a Human Rights Press Award for an investigation in police misconduct. And she's a graduate of LSE and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. So thank you very much. Here's your floor. Thank you, Shibani.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Formator, for having me on this very important panel. And thank you too to my co-panelists, Simon and Alexandra, who laid everything out very, very clearly. I'm also conscious of time. I want to make sure that our audience has as much time to ask questions. So I'll try to keep my comments brief. As Patrick mentioned, I was the Hong Kong bureau chief for the Washington Post And so I was based there in Hong Kong from 2018 to 2022. Between 2022 to 2023, I went back to Hong Kong a number of times to do a couple of investigative pieces that focused on, some flaws within the Jimmy Lai trial, including, harassment and torture of the key witnesses, as well as, to do some work on, for example, youth prisons and how they were starting to implement brainwashing kind of programs there, and trying to sort of pressure people to kind of give up their pro-democracy views and their views on Hong Kong, right? And what caused them to sort of participate in the protests in 2019. I would say that, a lot of that work that I did, and including, I recently published a book with my co-author called Among the Braves on a narrative, which is sort of a narrative history of the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. All of this I did with the backdrop in my mind that I would eventually be leaving Hong Kong. The reality is the type of, deep dives, investigative journalism, anything that kind of like pushes the boundaries and goes beyond sort of news and beyond reportage in Hong Kong is extremely, extremely hard to do today. The consequences are getting higher and higher. And, the reality of sort of navigating the complex system and landscape that, started with the national security law and then compounded with the introduction of Article 23 is very, very real for people in our profession. Speaking as a journalism practitioner who's worked all across Southeast Asia and has worked in countries that have always had, lack of protections for journalism, the very unfree press. And currently I'm based in Singapore. I'm now in Thailand separately on a trip. None of these places are particularly warm and fuzzy towards journalists. But even within this context, what makes Hong Kong particularly difficult is the lack of red lines and the lack of clarity around the red lines. And I think, especially with the introduction of Article 23, nobody knows exactly when that red line would have been crossed until and unless you cross it. And nobody wants to be in the situation that they will be sort of the first to cross it and will be held up sort of as an example of, what not to do under Article 23. The national security law, as Alexandra pointed out, was already very, very difficult for journalists in Hong Kong. We saw, immediately after its passage, right, the raid on Apple Daily, the shutting down of Stand News, the shutting down of Citizen News, and that all go away, right? These very, very important checks and balances and methods of kind of reporting domestically in Hong Kong. I think what has also happened, speaking more broadly within the sort of international outlets, right? So foreign media based in Hong Kong, is that they've all reconsidered Hong Kong as a base for their operations, right? The New York Times famously moved to Seoul. The Washington Post too had plans to massively, expand our presence in Hong Kong, which never really happened after the NSL. You see even other news organizations sort of hedging, and behind that, right, is something that affects us all, which is visas, right? A lot of news organizations have felt increasing pressure on visas, have had visa extensions for journalists either denied or they come with questions and what used to be like a very, very straightforward process, like you just submit your application and then you get a response back and you get your visa and then you extend it. 7 years later, you get PR. That whole system has now sort of changed dramatically. Right now, when a journalist goes and sort of applies for renewals, they often come back with like a lot of questions asking, what your affiliations are, what do you have any ties to political groups, asking, for a whole file of your stories and stuff that you've published before, all creating this very onerous press environment. And I think what that has led to, unfortunately, is some degree of self-censorship and a difficulty in pursuing, stories that are, too pushing the boundaries of what the Hong Kong government has sort of set up. And that's just in terms of access to Hong Kong, getting to Hong Kong. Once you are in Hong Kong and are trying to do this work, right? Even over the past year, sources have become much, much more afraid to speak. especially with Article 23 implemented, right? The most concerning bit of that law, right, for journalists is the provision surrounding state secrets, right? So the fact that it's now a crime not only to obtain, possess, and disclose non-public information, the fact that this pertains to so many different categories, right? Whether it's diplomacy, foreign affairs of the mainland, external affairs of Hong Kong, economic and social development, technological development, scientific technology. I mean, there's so many categories there that are potential trip-ups, right? Even for myself, in doing some of my recent stories on Hong Kong, when it comes to finding academics to speak, when it comes to finding, analysts to be quoted on the record, that has also become much, much harder. Oftentimes we are having to look for people who are outside of Hong Kong, and that creates an environment that's very, very difficult. The risk of putting our sources in danger is very, very real. I mean, Patrick mentioned some of my previous stories, and one of them I did in 2019 was an investigation into police brutality during the protests, right? And to get that, we used and utilized leaked documents from inside the police department, and we used that to then forensically put together videos and really break down like kind of the tactics of the police that we saw on the street and compare them with the police guidelines, and we managed to show, right, that the guidelines say X and then they're doing Y, right? And sort of they're in violation of their own conduct, they're in violation of their own standards, right? Something like that would be truly actually impossible to pull off today. I cannot imagine somebody wanting to put themselves in a scenario where they would leak something like that, because the laws and the legal punishment for doing that is just tremendous, right? And I think that goes beyond just more sensitive organizations like obviously the police. It also goes to like accountants. I mean, there was some reporting on how accountants were really, really worried about the passage of Article 23 because, they were worried that if they were looking at specific companies or whatever, and they find flaws or in their books, then is that considered a violation of Article 23 to raise that and to sort of expose that, right? So we're talking here about everything from the, traditionally kind of like sensitive work anyway that investigative journalists do, for example, in the police or so on, government, to, even the kind of like more mundane and the more boring, right? Like the basic sort of, work that goes on every day within a financial center, right? And ultimately, the loss to this is not just sort of accountability journalism and stuff that holds the government to account, but sort of day-to-day stuff like bad business practices, exposing sort of like corruption, exposing land grabbing, or land rights issues, a whole a swath of sort of coverage and thematic work in Hong Kong has been diminished because of the introduction of both of these laws, right? And also the few journalists that are operating in Hong Kong today. One of the things that I wanted to add too, obviously there's so much going on outside of Hong Kong, right? With exiled media, diaspora media, trying to keep pushing and keep covering Hong Kong, from the outside. One of the even more tragic things about Article 23 is that they've made funding and donation to these organizations very, very difficult, because they've cracked down on crowdfunding in a big way. And so I think the reality is that what was already, like, after the NSL passed, right, different groups, media organizations, and so on adjusted. They tried. They set up things outside. They sort of recalibrated and reconfigured. And then Article 23 came, and then it added just like a new layer of complexity, more restrictions, and more difficulties that further, impeded the ability of them to do their work, right? And a lot of those organizations, as Simon noted, right, they really need our support. They really need our help. And to do the kind of crucial work that they continue to do outside of Hong Kong. And I think the last point I would add is that there really, really hasn't been any sort of transparency from the Hong Kong government on how they plan to implement Article 23 when it comes to the media, right? Saying that there's been, there's press freedom and that continues to be respected in Hong Kong clearly has not managed to allay a lot of people's worries and fears and concerns. It has certainly even not managed to, get Alexandra into Hong Kong to do the work that she's mandated to do. So it really does ring sort of hollow, right? And ultimately, to sort of reassure people, right? They actually have to, seriously not only just say those assurances, but promise that, working journalists for, local and international organizations will not be harassed, will not be arbitrarily denied visas, arbitrarily denied entry into Hong Kong. And so far, the Hong Kong government has been unable to sort of promise that, right? And so we are seeing, a consistent sort of diminishing of Hong Kong as a place for, Asian headquarters of media organizations. And I think that is something that won't change anytime soon. Just from my observation, as I mentioned before, every media organization is kind of looking for a new place to sort of have their headquarters. There's no perfect solution. I mean, Singapore, Seoul, Tokyo, Australia, they all have, Taipei, they all have, some flaws. But really, what we're seeing is a paradigm shift within the way news gathering and news operations are conducted all across Asia because of Hong Kong being so diminished and flawed now as a place for journalists to sort of base themselves. And yeah, again, I'm conscious of time, so I just want to make sure that our audience has enough time to ask their questions. But yes, thank you so much for having me here today, and looking forward to the questions as well.
Thank you very much, Shibani. Like with all these challenges, we can imagine how difficult it is actually to be a journalist to report on Hong Kong nowadays. So it's really a big appreciation for your effort in writing the book as well. It's very, very challenging actually now to see any journalists would be doing that at the moment. So now I'm opening the floor for discussion. So if you, the audience, have any questions, please click the button raise hand, and then I will let you make your questions. And also, of course, for some others who would not want to speak, you can also type your questions in the chat box. Okay, so I've just seen one type questions. Maybe we can also go with that first. It'd be like this question's about the person mentioned that I've heard some, objectively speaking, only almost 2,000 political prisoners, and only a handful have been charged with NSL and Article 23 in 4 years. That these laws aren't very invasive in comparison to other countries. Have self-censorship and fear tactics resulted from NSL and Article 23 play a greater role? And can you explain if this is unique to Hong Kong and why? Would Simon want to answer this? Because it seems to be quite related to law. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, and thank you very much for the question. To begin with, yes, there's a lot of organisations that are doing assessment on the number of political prisoners. The estimate seems to be that it's approximately 1,800, 1,850. I think HKDC said the other day that it was 1,840. So yes, roughly about 2,000. And your comment about whether or not, or query about whether or not these laws aren't as evasive in comparison to other countries, I addressed a bit of that in my presentation. I think that the arguments from the Hong Kong government that these laws aren't as invasive is a false argument. To begin with, these countries are democracies. The laws can be amended, they can be changed. Secondly, there's a really robust opportunity for debate on these laws. I myself used to work at the peak legal professional body in Australia, Law Council of Australia, and I commented regularly. We wrote many submissions, issued media releases, held press conferences on the problems with Australia's national security laws. I don't see that happening in Hong Kong by civil society organisations. They're either promoting it, they've either been disbanded, or they're engaging in self-censorship. And there are oversights and monitoring mechanisms. So the comparison is a false one by the Hong Kong government, and it's one they really shouldn't continue to be making. The question that you've also asked is, have self-censorship and fear from the NSL and Article 23 played a greater role? Well, it's clear that it's curtailed behaviour and engagement and in response to the use of these laws. But that being said, I think there are some organisations that were actively involved in promoting crackdown on civil society organisations and the use of extra legal measures for a longer period of time. I mentioned, for example, the Law Society of Hong Kong, and they have been engaged very actively in supporting harsh and repressive laws over an extended period of time in Hong Kong. But some organisations used to be much more liberal. Hong Kong Bar Association is a really good example. But they changed the chair of the Hong Kong Bar Association, and now they're much more rapidly coming into line. Now, is that a case of self-censorship? Is that a case of protection? Maybe a combination of a number of these factors. But certainly what we do see is a really constraining environment for organisations. And this concept around commentary and engagement on Article 23 and national security law has intimidated a lot of people. And it is going to lead to an increased rise in political prisoners. And when we're talking about political prisoners, this includes people who are being detained for acting on their justifiable human rights, including the rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, that shouldn't be targeted by these laws. So perhaps I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Simon. So the second question that we see in chat box would be on what are the ways to improve the situation? So I think maybe it's a question for all the speakers. So maybe start from Alexandra.
Yes, sure. And I think what we need to do is to do more in terms of pressure on the Hong Kong authorities, and what have been done so far, which is of course very good too. Like we saw the EU resolution that was passed just a week ago that mentioned again Jimmy Lai, that mentioned the witness that has been reported tortured in China and DD. We saw this type of efforts from democracies, but what we haven't seen actually is the real action in place. And by the real action, I mean real pressure on the business community, real pressure on the Hong Kong authorities, also sanctions, something that would really pain them in a scope that will maybe make them change their attitude and how they behave in this situation, and maybe reverse this very, very worrying and very dangerous policies that we see right now in Hong Kong. And what we also need to do, and this is something we saw before in the past with the Chinese dissidents, the Chinese exiled media, we need to support them even more. And this is something that we as RSF try to do. We have our institutional support too. There's many exiled media, as Shibani mentioned, that decided to relocate to other countries, to UK, to Taiwan, Australia, US. And they really struggle right now because they cannot get any financing from from Hong Kong, because it can be considered as breaching the national security law. They have really a huge struggle with finding themselves in the new situation, and we need to prepare for them schemes. We need to find a ways of how to support them financially, how to give them ways of continue the work from outside when it's so difficult to do it inside of Hong Kong.
Thank you, Alexandra. So anything to add, Shibani? Do you have any take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing that is clear is that Hong Kong is very, very much still wanting to protect its status and reputation as an international financial center and hub for business, right? That continues to be their messaging, even in talking about Article 23, and even when they, have talked about these laws, they say, well, the laws are passed, Hong Kong is now stable, we can get back to business. And I think they really want it to be true that Hong Kong can still, be where Goldman and Citi and all these banks can base themselves, all these companies can come in. I think as journalists, right, one of the most interesting things I've seen is so much coverage around how the business community is actually souring on Hong Kong too, and the business community is being impacted by that as well. And I think that is something that is really quite impactful for the Hong Kong government, because they respond to that interest group more than any other, right? I mean, that has been their whole structure of the city is to facilitate, finance, business, trade between the mainland and the rest of the world. So if they're realizing that, that is chipping away, that, companies are leaving, that due diligence companies are leaving, that banks are sort of relocating their stuff outside of Hong Kong, I think that is the thing that will maybe prompt a little bit of a calculation of like, have we gone too far, or have other steps we can take to sort of like rein this back in a little bit, right? And I think that's something that like has been a very interesting thing to see and to indeed focus on, right? Which is that the impact and sort of the souring of the business community on Hong Kong as well.
Thank you. So, okay, so I see one more question in the chat box. So, what are some of the practical tips, risk management wise, can you give to program coordinator or foundation who are receiving requests and willing to financially support the independent journalists based in and out of Hong Kong? So I don't know how you think about this. It seems to be more like sensitive issue on funding. So do you have any views on that, like Alessandra and Shibani?
Maybe for me, very quick, that for inside of Hong Kong, we actually don't have any good tools right now, and this is also something that we are struggling very much as the international NGO. Any type of financing that would come from us would be again considered as breaching national security law. And in the past 3 years, it has been extremely difficult to any type of foundations, NGOs to support people on the ground. So in a way, Hong Kong authorities, by having these 2 laws, achieved what wanted and limited the scope of supporting the civil society that is still operating on the ground, not to mention the media outlets. To the scope, as Shibani also mentioned before, is that even putting money in crowdfunding, sending money as the way of like looking at the newsletter of some media outlets can be considered as breaching national security law and receiving the money from abroad, because we saw that this type of evidence was used against media outlets in the past and used as the argument why to shut them down and why they're so dangerous. So for this, so far, unfortunately, I think we don't have any good tips. Maybe Shibani, you have on your side, but on my side, we're still struggling and we're thinking of ways how to overcome these difficulties. And this is also the reason why most of our support in the past 3 years, and we have 2 types of support. One is the emergency assistance. So we can provide the legal support, we can provide money for relocation, we can provide money for restarting the way how the journalists can continue the work. It can be equipment, it can be even some small salaries and so on. We can provide this money in the first 6 months since the journalist is relocating to other country, or when it has directly been put under pressure of the government. And the second thing that RSF has been doing, and is quite new program in the past year, is the institutional support. So giving the institutional means for the journalists who are working on exile, trying to support them again financially so that they can keep working, they can keep expanding, keep learning how to operate from abroad, because this is different, more hostile in a way environment that they don't understand, they don't know how to keep doing the work on this in these new countries, plus capacity building. And this is something I think many organizations are doing. So giving the capacity for the journalists, for reporters, so that they can find the ways themselves how to keep working despite being so far away, how to keep working, how to protect themselves digitally, how to make sure that they don't put under threat their sources, finding business models on how they could continue the work despite not being physically on the ground. So this is my tips and something we've been doing. If any of other speakers have something to add, it will be also very interesting to learn maybe from some other experiences.
Thank you. Shibani or Simon, do you have anything to add on that? No. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, just quickly, Shibani, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, nothing for me.
I think Alexandra's summary is excellent. It's an extremely difficult environment. Getting yourself digitally and technologically safe, whether through how you protect information, your sources, and receiving training and education on that is particularly important. And I agree on the role of capacity building. I think that there are ways to undertake capacity building that don't necessarily infringe upon on the SNSO, and there's a range of different ways that can be managed through education. The other mechanism that I'd certainly encourage from a program funding perspective, and as a program coordinator, is thinking about what activities certainly that can be done that don't involve monetary amounts. So again, talking to that education capacity building, but pro bono support, including where pro bono support could be provided locally within Hong Kong through friendly businesses and organisations, and activities that might appear on their face to be much more benign. So, for example, around internet safety and security, or protecting yourself from hacking, a number of these different mechanisms and activities can be really valuable to local organisations who are often very small and don't have the resources or capacity or know-how to understand the implications of some of that work on their activities and how they might be caught under the SNSO.
Thank you, Simon. So there's one more comment and questions in the chat box. So thank you for such an informative and honest sharing of your observations. So I recently left Hong Kong after over 10 years as an academic leader and impressed by your insights. Do you think that sanctions against Hong Kong from OECD countries help or inhibit press freedom? Any of the speakers want to comment on this? Shibani? Yeah.
Right, yeah. I think it's really hard to say, but at least looking at what's happened in the past, the reality is unfortunately that once there were sanctions and any kind of punitive measures from the US in particular, it was American media organizations that were punished for that, right? There was a lot of the pro quo things that happened under Trump, right? Where people who were, very different from the work that we do. They were working for China Daily and other state outlets in the US, right? And they had their, visas revoked and were kicked out of the US. China retaliated, right, by expelling a whole group of journalists, including my colleagues from the Washington Post, from mainland China. And, we've really struggled to get back in a clear way since and get visas back since. What we've seen is that if sanctions are coming from specific countries, right, like for example the US or maybe the UK or others, the scapegoating will happen to anyone that is affiliated with those countries, unfortunately. And so, at least from the experience in the past, it has seemed that sanctions have unfortunately made the government very guarded and very angry, and then very either pressured by the mainland or pressured by themselves to take some kind of action punitively against that country. And oftentimes journalists can be like people stuck in the middle, right, who are like collateral damage in that more high level process.
Thank you, Shibani. So anything more to add from the other two speakers? Simon, yeah.
Yeah, just on the sanctions measures and perhaps generally, because I know that this is a strong call to action from a lot of civil society organisations, especially those operating overseas. And it's true that, as Shibani mentioned, you often see that retaliatory response when sanctions are imposed. We've seen that particularly by China, by the Hong Kong government. I think where those responses to a certain extent can be mitigated is through coordinated action by states operating at the same time. That's what we haven't had on a variety of Hong Kong human rights issues. Australia, for example, still hasn't imposed targeted sanctions on particular individuals in relation to Hong Kong. So in reference to the SNSO, back to my earlier points, it's really important to assure that there's coordinated advocacy because that provides greater protection and coverage. I think the other part of sanctions is often this issue of accountability. So where do we derive accountability for violations of human rights? And it's incredibly difficult because the Hong Kong government is toxic in the way that engages with the international community, adopting that sort of a wolf warrior type diplomacy increasingly. So you have to look at accountability measures. And if states aren't willing to take the step of approaching international courts, sanctions provide one of those few opportunities. And I know that that does provide a lot of support to civil society community. So it certainly needs to be balanced about the impacts and the effects, but also driving accountability and ensuring that it's coordinated when it does happen, which isn't happening right now.
Thank you, Simon. Alessandra?
Yes, just to add to it, that I totally agree with Simon, and this is what we saw in the past, that when we have one country like United States that are imposing the sanctions, that it will not work. What we need to do now is to work together as all democracies, all countries that are cherishing the human rights, and giving simple statements, it's not enough anymore. So we need more direct actions, something that really will change the course and will make the Hong Kong government and Beijing more cautious about how they will go with the next step. So yeah, I think what Simon said is exactly what is the point here. And it cannot be one campaign lead by the one country. I would really want to see more coming from UK, from European Union countries, from Australia, which should come together in this view and do something, and to and maybe sanction for one of the opportunities, one of the ideas that could be put together. But it cannot be done by just one single out country for sure.
Thank you, Alessandra. So I'm conscious of time. I do think there's a question actually from my observation of your presentation conversations. This one thing is about the very blurred and ambiguous red line that actually been like creating a lot of problems. So how do you think like would be the way to move forward after we talk about it's difficult like to handle by like sanctioning, which actually would be retaliation, and then also there would be also punitive measures that would be actually quite daunting and challenging. So what would be the way to move forward that you would have any advice for aspiring journalists, lawyers, and other civil society actors? What do you think they can still do under such restrictive environment? So I mean, like all the speakers, if you have views on that, you just can talk about that.
Yeah, in terms of journalism, I think there's certainly a lot that can still be done within Hong Kong that, like I said, does not necessarily need to be like overtly political, but is still documenting and really like showing the impact on communities, right? There are so many issues in Hong Kong that are worth reporting, right? I mean, the climate issues are real there, land issues, you know, the socioeconomic issues, like these are all very, very real things that impact Hong Kongers every single day, even without the sort of more broad political suppression that people face as well. And I think that it's incumbent on journalists, right, to continue like going out into the community, continue interviewing people, because you might be surprised, people might still be willing to talk, especially on subjects like that are not considered like overtly political. I feel like the really great regret that I have is seeing a lot of organizations in Hong Kong put on these restrictions on themselves and self-censor themselves and stop doing the work that they're mandated to do, even before somebody has told them to stop, right? You know, there are notable examples with the FCC Hong Kong and the cancellation of the Human Rights Press Awards before, but there's certainly more, right? And you know, before anyone tells you to quit, before anyone tells you to stop doing what you're doing, people have already chosen to do it themselves, even when sometimes the risk is not so great. I mean, there are obviously risks, and I don't want to understate that, but I think it's incumbent on journalists to keep fighting and keep pushing within this new environment, right? Because there's certainly so much that can be done, and to really resist the urge, right, to self-censor, to resist the urge to just kind of like capitulate, and resist the urge to also like, like if I can't cover like political things or I can't criticize the government, there's nothing left to do. I mean, that's simply not true, right? And I think we can sort of keep pushing on all of those different.
Right. Thank you, Alessandra.
Maybe to very fast to ask to what Shibani said, I totally agree. And also the thing I want to emphasize maybe is that press freedom is not dead yet in Hong Kong. This is not yet the situation that we can see in China when any topic is a red line, and things like Me Too movement, corruption, environment start to be red line in China. In Hong Kong, there's still some scope and space for journalists to do the work. And what is also interesting, there's still many journalists who are doing this work on a daily basis, many independent individuals who are trying to report on the issues, who decided to open the new, smaller media outlets. For them, it's very difficult to, of course, continue again because of the money, because of the red lines that are appearing, but they're still out there and they're still doing the job as before. So we need to try to support them in any ways we can, read their articles, to be there, to basically see what they're producing, to again support them with the capacity building, to support them with any terms of support that they need at the time, and just be there for them and to read and to try to share the story of Hong Kong to the outside world, and not only focus on the fact that what happened, and of course the situation is very grave and it's more and more difficult, but to give you one example how they try to circumvent the situation. I know one journalist who told me that when there's a very sensitive story and he wants to go with the story when he wants to publish something, then he decides not to publish it with his own media outlet because he knows that it could put under threat his colleagues and his organization. But he, for example, publishes it on his Facebook or on Instagram, somewhere that he can share what he investigates on with the public, but in a way that is only putting him under threat if there's a problem and if there's a visible red line that could be targeted by the government. So there's still ways, and everyone needs to assess its own safety. It needs to be personal decision, individual decision by each journalist for which stories they want to go or what they want to report about. But just to say, there's still some scope and space, and we need to try to support it and to work on it.
Thank you very much. Simon, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So, just to agree with what Alexandra and Shibani have said, there are a lot of organisations and activities that's being done in Hong Kong that we should continue to support, whether it's in the right of migrant workers, climate change, asylum seekers, ethnic minorities. A lot of this activity still continues to go on. It's shifted and modified a little bit. So, yes, organisations engaging in self-censorship. I think also another concerning trend that I saw over my time in Hong Kong is not so much the organisations often self-censoring, but to the role of boards, which I think is underappreciated when we look at the issue of self-censorship. But still, there's many groups that are doing great work. So they should be supported in terms of capacity development. How can you provide them with training resources? How also can you invite them to overseas events, conferences? I have had some really successful engagement with lawyers who are based in Hong Kong who attended a conference that I went to last year, and they're able to engage proactively with me and another organisation because they were there, because they were present, and they weren't able to do so effectively in Hong Kong. And I think with lawyers, that's a similar message I'll say as well. A lot of really good young lawyers who are doing work in human rights space. They might not call themselves human rights lawyers. They might engage on criminal law matters that might not always have high profile attention, such as the Jimmy Lai case, but they're doing amazing work day in, day out. And we need to make sure that information is collected, that they're supported, and they're able to engage more widely. So don't give up hope is certainly my message, and continue to support those doing great work in Hong Kong.
Great, thank you, Simon. Yeah, don't give up hope. And then also I can see all the very optimistic and also very encouraging comments from all our speakers. Thanks a lot for all of you to join today's discussion. I think, of course, there are obviously many challenges ahead we can see because of the very ambiguous definitions in many aspects of the law, and also the way how we see the Hong Kong government's been reacting to comments on the law, and also the number of people being prosecuted in relation to NSL, and also now with the Article 23 legislation, it's actually even unclear how many more people would be prosecuted under this new law. and any more like self-censorships among all the civil society partners and participants. So, but anyway, today is really great discussion. Thank you very much. Very honored for us to have the three speakers. So let us thank them again for joining us for the discussion. So we will have other follow-up activities in future in relation to this law and also another related issues. Thanks a lot for joining us. Thank you very much, Simon, and also Alessandra. Shibani is running for her meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.